Hi! Welcome to the Cozy Nook. Settle in, relax, and together let's enter a world that is full of wonder, is sometimes mysterious, and can even be sinister. In a land far, far away, where magic is endless and dreams always come true. Or do they? I'm your narrator, and today I read to you Bram Stoker's Dracula. Chapter 1. Welcome to Transylvania. What a long way this is from England, Jonathan Harker thought as he looked over the old hotel he had been given a room in. The old woman who kept the place looked nearly as ancient herself. "Here's a letter for you, young man," she said, handing Jonathan an envelope. He opened it quickly, knowing it could come from only one person, the very one who had brought him here on this strange journey. Jonathan read the few lines it contained. "My friend, welcome to Transylvania. Tomorrow take the coach to the Borgo Pass. My carriage will meet you and bring you to me. Your friend, Dracula." Jonathan was glad to read the message. It meant his long journey was almost over. He had traveled from England all the way across Europe, over mountains, across rivers, and through deep, dark forests. Transylvania was one of the wildest parts of the continent. In fact, he couldn't find the castle of his host, Count Dracula, on any map. He was looking forward to meeting the Count and asking him about some of the strange sights he had seen along the way. The people here were descendants of the Huns and the Turks. The men wore their hair long and had thick black mustaches. The hills were steep and wild. Jonathan made sure he noted everything in his journal so that he would be able to describe all the marvelous sights to his fiancée, Mina, when he returned. Jonathan was a young lawyer. He had come all this way to meet with Count Dracula, who had purchased a house in London, sight unseen. When he asked the landlord of the hotel and the old woman, his wife, about the Count, they both crossed themselves and refused to say a word. Jonathan thought this odd. He found it even more disturbing when the old woman said to him, "Must you go, young gentleman? Oh, must you go?" Jonathan asked her what she meant. "Tonight is the feast of St. George. At midnight, all evil things in the world have power. Do you realize where it is you are going?" she asked. She fell down on her knees and begged him not to make the trip. Finally, she put a rosary and crucifix around his neck and told him to wear it. "For your mother's sake," she said. The landlady talked to the driver of the coach. Jonathan looked for the words they used in a dictionary. It made him uneasy to realize they were talking of devils and witches and vampires. He made a note to ask Count Dracula about all these local superstitions. The coach carried its passengers out into the wild countryside through dark pine woods. The road was rugged, yet the driver whipped the horses to go faster and faster. They climbed far into the mountains, the coach rocking on its leather springs like a boat at sea. The Borgo Pass was a gap where the road went through the mountains and down the other side. It was surrounded by deep, thick woods. Jonathan got out of the coach. He felt himself trembling and tried to shake the uneasy feeling. A carriage suddenly appeared, drawn by 4 black horses and driven by a tall man in a huge black hat, his face hidden in shadow. He held out a hand to help Jonathan into the carriage. His grip was like steel. All Jonathan could see of his face was 2 gleaming eyes and sharp white teeth. The coach and its other passengers continued on, leaving Jonathan alone in the carriage with its strange driver. Suddenly he felt very cold, a strange, lonely feeling. "The night is cold," the driver said. "My master, the Count, asked me to take good care of you. Here is a rug to keep you warm. Under the seat you will find some plum brandy." Somewhere in the distance a dog howled, and farther off another answered. A minute later another. A sharper howl echoed through the mountains. A wolf. The horses reared up and plunged. Jonathan was so scared he almost jumped from the carriage. The carriage went on into the night. It passed through a tunnel of dark trees. The wind began to moan and grow bitter cold. Snow was falling. The howling of the wolves closed in on all sides, but the driver didn't seem worried by them. Several times the driver stopped the carriage and ran off toward mysterious blue flames that burned in the woods. Jonathan had to rub his eyes. He could see the flame shining right through the body of the driver as if it were made of glass. The carriage stopped again and the driver wandered far into the darkness. Jonathan waited nervously for him to return. Then the horses started to tremble and screech with fright. What could the matter be? Jonathan asked himself. I don't hear any wolves howling now. He looked out into the darkness. When the moon came out from behind a cloud, Jonathan could see that the wolves were all around the carriage. The moonlight showed their white teeth and loose red tongues and shaggy hair. Their silence was worse than their howling. Jonathan, all alone in the dark, was so terrified that he couldn't move. Suddenly, they all began to howl as if something had touched them and set them off. The horses jumped and reared and rolled their eyes. Jonathan beat on the side of the carriage to scare the terrible beasts away. The wolves just came closer. Chapter 2: The Strange Castle. Just as the wolves were closing in, Jonathan heard the carriage driver approaching. The man ordered the wolves back. He shouted and waved his arm. They obeyed his command and slunk away from the carriage. This incident was so frightening that Jonathan shook with fear as the carriage continued on into the mountains. On and on they went, climbing ever upward. Jonathan must have fallen asleep. The next thing he knew, they had stopped in a courtyard before a massive stone building. Jonathan again felt the driver's icy grip as the man helped him down from the carriage. Then the strange man led the horses through an archway and was gone. Jonathan stood there alone in the gloom. Is this a dream? Jonathan asked himself. What kind of strange adventure have I gotten into? There's no knocker on this door. Will I have to wait here until the morning? Suddenly, with a rattling of chains and a loud grating, the nail-studded door of the castle swung back. A tall old man dressed all in black stood staring at him. Welcome to my house, he said. Enter freely and of your own will. When Jonathan stepped inside, the man grasped his hand with a hand that was cold as ice, the hand of a dead man. The grip was terribly strong, just like that of the carriage driver. Count Dracula? Jonathan asked. Yes, I am Dracula. I bid you welcome, Mr. Hawker. The Count carried Jonathan's bags himself. A few minutes later, Jonathan sat down to a roast chicken and salad. The Count did not eat. He said he'd had his supper already, but sat and asked Jonathan many questions about his trip. During the supper, Jonathan had a chance to study the Count's looks. The high forehead, the massive eyebrows that nearly met over his nose, his sharp teeth that stuck out over his very red lips. His ears were pointed, his skin very pale. The Count's hands were most unusual, thick and with hair growing on the palms. The fingernails were long and pointed. When one of them reached out to touch him, Jonathan felt a little sick. Out the window, Jonathan saw the first streak of dawn. Everything was very still, but from the valley below came the sound of many wolves howling. The Count's eyes gleamed, and he whispered, Listen to them. They are the children of the night. What music they make. With that, he bid Jonathan good night and left him alone to wonder about all the strange things that had happened. When he awoke late in the day, Jonathan found his breakfast waiting and a note from the Count saying he had to be out. Everything in the castle was very luxurious. The plates were pure gold, but very old. Strangely, there was not a mirror to be seen anywhere, not even in the bathroom, nor were there any of the servants that would be expected in a big castle. Jonathan felt all alone. He spent the time till evening in the Count's library. He found many books on England. Finally, the Count joined him. I have read all about your country, the Count said. I hope you can teach me to speak your language. But Count, you speak English very well, Jonathan replied. Not so. I know that everyone in London would consider me a stranger. When I move there, I want to fit in like everyone else. I understand, Jonathan said. Different countries have different customs, the Count went on. We are in Transylvania now, not England. You may find things strange here. But tell me all about my new house." "The estate is called Carfax," Jonathan said, showing the Count the papers for the purchase. "It has a deep, dark-looking pond, a large, very old house, and an abandoned chapel. There are only a few houses nearby. I should mention that one of them has been turned into a private lunatic asylum, but you can't see it from your house." "I am glad the house is old," the Count said. "I could not stand a new house. I am glad, too, to hear of the chapel. That means a graveyard. I like places that are gloomy. I wish to be alone with my thoughts." Again, the Count did not join Jonathan at supper. Afterward, they talked for many hours. When a rooster crowed to announce the dawn, the Count jumped to his feet. "Your conversation about England is too interesting," the Count said. "I forget how time flies. I must let you get to bed," he added. Jonathan slept for a few hours. When he awoke, he began to shave, using a small mirror he'd brought with him. Suddenly he felt a hand on his shoulder. Startled, he spun around. It was Dracula. "Good morning," the Count said. What amazed Jonathan was that he hadn't seen the Count approach. He looked in the mirror again. It was true. The Count's image did not appear in the glass even though he stood right in front of it. Jonathan was so startled he cut himself a little with his razor. When the Count saw the trickle of blood that ran down his neck, his eyes blazed with fury. He grabbed for Jonathan's throat, but his hand accidentally touched the crucifix that the old woman at the hotel had hung around Jonathan's neck. He immediately calmed down. "Take care not to cut yourself in this country," Dracula warned. "It is dangerous, and you don't need this. Away with it." He took Jonathan's mirror and flung it out the window. It shattered into 1,000 pieces on the ground below. Jonathan again went into breakfast alone. He had not yet seen the Count eat or drink. A strange man, Jonathan thought yet again. When he finished, Jonathan explored the castle a little. He found that the building stood on the edge of a steep cliff. On 3 sides, a stone thrown from a window would drop 1,000 feet. Beyond, he could see nothing but empty woods. But he soon discovered something else. All the doors to the outside were locked. The castle was a prison, and he was the prisoner. When he went back to his room, Jonathan found the Count making his bed. Then he knew that what he suspected was true. There were no servants in the castle. He was alone with Dracula. In fact, Dracula must have been the driver of the carriage who had been able to control the wild wolves with his command. He felt that he was in grave danger. He was glad that the old lady had made him wear the crucifix. It seemed to have the power to protect him. That night, Dracula described ancient wars as if he had fought in them himself. He told stories about how his people had won great and bloody battles. But the warlike days are over, he said. Blood is too precious a thing today. Just then the dawn was breaking and the Count hurried off to bed as he did every day. Jonathan spent the day studying books in the library. In the evening, the Count came to him with many legal matters to discuss. "I may want to ship some goods to a port in England," he said. "I would need a lawyer to claim them." "We could arrange that with lawyers we know," Jonathan suggested. "Now I would like you to write your employer," the Count said, "and to your friends to let them know you are staying with me for a month." "So long?" Jonathan asked, his heart growing cold. "I will take no refusal," the Count said. Jonathan could only agree. His employer, Mr. Hawkins, had asked him to do whatever he could for the Count. "Don't talk about anything but business in your letters," the Count warned. "Tell them you are well and looking forward to seeing them. That's all." Dracula smiled as he handed Jonathan the writing paper. 2 of the Count's sharp upper teeth hung down over his lower lip, like fangs, Jonathan thought with a shudder. Before he left Jonathan alone, the Count said that he would be busy that night and that they would not be able to have their usual talk. "I must warn you," he said, "that you should not sleep anywhere in the castle except in your own room. You might have nightmares." Jonathan wondered if nightmares could be any worse than being locked in the strange castle. That night, he left his room and went to a staircase window where he could look out. Just then he saw a movement. It came from the window of the Count's own room. Jonathan drew back in, then carefully looked out again. The Count was coming out. Jonathan could not see his face, but he could recognize him. and the Count's hands, certainly he could not mistake those. Jonathan was amazed. The Count slowly came out of the window and began to crawl down, his face towards the castle wall. His black cloak spread out like wings. Jonathan couldn't believe his eyes. It must be a trick of the moonlight, Jonathan thought, some weird effect of shadow. But it was true. Dracula was clinging to the cracks in the stones. He was climbing down the wall like a lizard. Chapter 3. Hall of Horrors. Jonathan knew that he must escape from this horrible place. He crept through the castle again, trying every door. All were locked. The Count must have kept the keys himself. Jonathan's only hope was to get into Dracula's room and steal them. Finally, he found one door that was not fastened. As Jonathan pushed on it, its rusty hinges let it swing back. It led into a dark wing of the castle. Jonathan knew he might not have this chance again. He tiptoed ahead into the darkness. The loneliness of the place made him tremble. Still, it felt good to be away from the Count. He lay down on a couch and looked out the window at the lovely moonlit night. Feeling tired, he remembered the Count's warning not to sleep in any but his own room. I won't obey him, he thought. Why shouldn't I sleep where I like? He drowsed. Then, half awake, he saw 3 women. They were circling him and whispering together. 2 were dark, with piercing eyes like the Count's. The third had golden hair and gleaming green eyes. All had lips as red as rubies and brilliant white teeth. The 2 dark women laughed and said to the fair one, "You go first, we will follow. He is young and strong. There will be blood enough for all of us." The golden-haired woman came and bent over Jonathan. He could feel her breath on his neck. It was sweet but also bitter, like the smell of blood. Jonathan was terrified. Suddenly, the Count burst into the room. His hand reached out and grabbed the neck of the fair-haired woman. His eyes were furious, his teeth bared in rage. He hurled the woman across the room and motioned the others back. "How dare you touch him?" he cried. "This man belongs to me. You may content yourselves with this." He tossed the bag onto the floor. It moved as if it contained something alive. One of the women rushed to open it. Jonathan thought he heard the cry of a child. The others gathered around. Then they seemed to fade into the moonlight. The horror of it all made Jonathan faint. He woke in his own bed and wondered if he hadn't dreamt the whole thing. But he knew he couldn't have. He knew that out there in the castle there were 3 women waiting to feast on his blood. That night, the Count told Jonathan to write 3 letters to his friends back home. The first will say your work is nearly done. The next that you are starting for home. The first will say your work is nearly done. The next that you are starting for home. The third that you have left the castle and are on your way. Jonathan had no choice but to go along with the plan. The letters would be dated June 12, June 19, and June 29. Now he knew he had only a few weeks to live. He was doomed. He had to get word out. Lately, he had seen a group of gypsies outside the castle. If he could get them to mail the letters for him, he could contact his friends before it was too late. I can write to Mina in shorthand, he thought. No one will be able to read it but her, and I will write to Mr. Hawkins, telling him to expect news from her. He wrote the letters and threw them down to the gypsies with a gold piece. They took them and bowed, as if they understood. At last, there was hope. But the next day, the Count came into Jonathan's room. "The gypsies have given me these letters," he said. "One is from you to Mr. Hawkins. Fine, it will be sent. The other contains strange symbols. It is a vile thing and must be destroyed." He threw the letter into the fire. That day, some delivery men came to the castle. Jonathan ran into his window and shouted to them. They did not understand English. They looked at him as if he were a madman. One of them said something and the others laughed. Jonathan watched them unload a shipment of large wooden boxes with rope handles. That night, Jonathan again saw Dracula crawl down the side of the castle. Later he heard the Count return. At the same moment, a wail came from the courtyard of the castle. A woman was standing there. When she saw Jonathan at the window, she cried, "Monster! Give me my child!" She ran to the huge door and beat against it with her fists. Above him, Jonathan heard the Count's harsh whisper. Suddenly, a pack of wolves appeared in the courtyard. The woman hardly had time to cry out. The wolves went away, licking their lips. The next day, Jonathan made his most desperate effort to escape. Taking off his boots, he climbed out onto the narrow stone ledge that ran across the castle wall. Trying not to look down, he edged his way along until he reached Count Dracula's room. It was empty, but he could not find any keys, only a pile of gold and money from countries all over the world. Then he found a door that led down a stone passageway. It passed like a tunnel into the ruins of a chapel. The smell was sickly and awful. Inside the chapel were the boxes that had been delivered. Most of them held nothing but soil, but in one Jonathan found, lying on fresh dirt, the Count. He was either dead or asleep. His eyes were wide open, but he had no breath or heartbeat. In his eyes, Jonathan saw a look of such evil hatred that he couldn't stand it. He hurried back to his own room. Before Jonathan knew it, it was nearly June 29th. "Tomorrow, my friend, we must part," the Count said. "You will return to your beautiful England. I hope I will see you again at Castle Dracula." "Why can't I go tonight?" Jonathan asked, testing him. "By all means, go if you wish," the Count said. Jonathan hurried to the front door. He was surprised to find it unlocked. He started to pull it open, and at that moment he heard the howls of the wolves. They rushed toward the door, their teeth gleaming. Jonathan knew there was no hope in trying to outwit the Count. He had to wait till the next morning. The next day, Jonathan again dared to cross the ledge to the Count's room. He went down into the ruined chapel. There was Dracula in his box. He looked younger, his flesh swollen as if with blood. "This is the creature I'm helping to move to London," Jonathan thought, "where he will find the victims without number." In horror, Jonathan lifted a shovel and swung the blade down at that horrible face. But the eyes of the Count blazed so brightly that they seemed to turn the shovel aside. It only gashed his forehead. Then the box fell shut. Jonathan ran back to the Count's room. Downstairs he heard the doors creak open as the gypsies came to take away the boxes. He heard them hammering the lids shut and the sound of their heavy feet. "Now I am alone in the castle with this awful woman," he thought. "Those devils." He had to get out. He ran to the window. He wouldn't stay there. This time he would creep along the ledge until he found a way to escape, or he would die trying. "Goodbye, Mina," he thought of his beloved. He stepped out onto the ledge.